Greetings. We're following up the spiritual checkup, comparing the spiritual to the physical, with a series of what should be 4 messages that compare the spiritual growth process and markers in that spiritual growth process to our spiritual growth. The first one we want to do is your faith should stand in the power of God. It's interesting to me to watch babies learn to crawl, and then before they walk, they go through this stage where they go and pull up on things, and they just learn to stand. They crawl, then they stand, then they walk, then they run, and then they get to where they can do many other things after they have mastered those particular talents. Our text verse is in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, in verse 5, where it says that your faith should not stand in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Paul, as a former pastor of the church in Corinth, is writing to them concerning certain problems that now existed in the church. The first problem was some had misunderstood the role of the pastor and the message which he was to proclaim. In 1 Corinthians 10, we find, "Now I beseech you, brethren, by the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, that you all speak the same thing, and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and in the same judgment. For it hath been declared unto me of you, my brethren, by them which are of the household of Chloe, that there are contentions among you." Verse 12 states the contention was over the preachers, the pastors that had their message and their method of preaching. It says that some in the church held Paul and his work in the highest esteem, but others in the church held Apollos and his work in the highest esteem. Some in the church held Peter and his work in the highest esteem. Yea, even some were mature enough to bypass all these and hold Christ and his work in the highest esteem. The same problem still continues to exist in churches today. People compare, contrast, critique, and choose one preacher or pastor over another. I would remind you, as John 1 teaches us about John the Baptist, the preachers are only human. They have limitations. Each one is called by God, and each one is used by God. I understand there's no mold for preachers to be stamped out of. God knows the liabilities, and he knows the assets of every man that he chooses to put into the ministry. And he moves them to the place where they can serve him best. Division and contention are still the results of the membership of churches playing this childish preacher picking game. Programs may show more people in the services, but they will not necessarily produce more faith in God and durative fruit as God desires. Paul reaffirms the purpose of his ministry in Corinth in 1 Corinthians 1:17 when he says, "For Christ sent me not to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom of words, lest the cross of Christ should be made of none effect." The chiefest area of conflict seems to have been the oratory ability of the man and those whom he had baptized. So Paul states he was not sent to baptize. Paul says that he was sent to preach. Paul says he was sent to preach not in words of wisdom, not in excellency of speech, not enticing words of wisdom. In fact, I think Paul was trying to tell us that he had preached in a manner to de-emphasize his own abilities, that the focus could be on the message and not the messenger. In 1 Corinthians 2:2, he said, "For I determined not to know anything among you, save Jesus Christ and him crucified." Paul was sent to preach because the preaching of the cross is the power of God unto salvation, as he says in Romans 1:16. Here in 1 Corinthians 1:8, he says, "For the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness, but unto us which are saved it is the power of God." Paul was also sent to preach because that's God's chosen method for calling the lost to salvation. 1 Corinthians 1:21 says, "For after that, in the wisdom of God, the world by wisdom knew not God. It pleased God by the foolishness of preaching to save them that believe." He goes on to say in the next verse, the Jews required a sign. Christ was their sign. The Greeks then sought wisdom. He says Christ was their wisdom. For the Jews require a sign and the Greeks seek after wisdom. Verse 23 says, "But we preach Christ crucified. Unto the Jews, a stumbling block, and unto the Gentiles, foolishness. But unto them which are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God, and the wisdom of God." See, Christ became a stumbling block to the Jews because they refused to believe him. Christ became foolishness to the Greeks because they refused to believe him. Paul points out that contrary to our thinking, God does not use the wise, the mighty, and the noble things to save men. Rather, God uses the foolish, the weak, the base, and the despised things.